When I was very young, I remember my dad always had the latest Stephen King novel to read. It wasn't until the Stand miniseries in 1994 that I took an interest in them myself. I first read The Stand and then went through every single Stephen King novel we had in the house. When I ran out of those, I went to the used bookstore to get more. It wasn't long afterward that I started a new tradition. I would finish reading a novel and then we would head straight to the video store and I would rent the movie. In the last couple years, I started revisiting a lot of Stephen King's works. So after doing a Harry Potter book-to-movie comparison, I thought it might be really fun to go ahead and do the same thing with the Stephen King stories. He's had more adaptations than anyone else living today. And sometimes they're very accurate, and sometimes they're wrong. Some things work better in prose and others on the screen, so an unfaithful adaptation doesn't always mean a bad one. Welcome to the Castle Rock Companion. To start off my series, I thought I'd go with one of the most popular Stephen King stories of all time, Misery. There's a piece of writer's advice that says, write what you know, and Stephen King certainly takes that advice to heart by frequently making his main characters writers. Of all of them, I don't think any of them give us as deep an insight of what it means to be a writer as Paul Sheldon does. Misery is always ranked high among his works for me, and this time I fell in love with it all the more thanks to my own writing experiences. I have a pretty severe problem with this cover. I mean, sure, going into it, reading the synopsis, you know it's Stephen King, you probably have a decent idea of what's going to happen, but to flat out show the axe right there and her coming for Paul, it's just a little too obvious, don't you think? This one is even worse, though at least it's pretty comical. From what I have seen, the first edition just showed a typewriter on the cover, and that's a lot better. The current paperback is the same way. Granted, I'm not sure anything could ruin that moment in the book. I mean, it's just so horrifying. The fact that it's realistically horrifying makes it all the worse. We'll never run into a Pennywise or a Randall Flagg in our lifetimes, but we could run into an Annie Wilkes. While I enjoy King's ensemble cast, I do think the fact that this story is centered around two people is one of its strengths. We really get to see Paul and his misery, desperation, addictions, and coping mechanisms. And we get to know Annie, at least as well as one can know an unpredictable psychopathic killer. I can't stress enough just how unsettling Annie is. Her mood swings, the things she does to Paul or the things she makes him do, are some of the most unsettling things I've ever read. I also really love that we get glimpses into the story within the story. Given how wrapped up Paul gets in Misery's return, it really helps to show us rather than just tell us. I love the way he describes writing as looking through the hole in the paper. It's an excellent way to describe those moments when you start feeling more like you're just transcribing something you're seeing in another world, rather than making it up. Add to that the description of writing as an addiction and a coping mechanism, and you can understand why some of us are just compelled to write. It really can be a relief and a form of escapism at times. Annie is of course an extreme version of the #1 fan, and like any good villain, we should be able to see a little bit of ourselves within her. However, I have to say that I've never really felt like writers murder the characters I love. The only exception I can think of is a certain couple that J.K. Rowling kills in Deathly Hallows, and that's because it happens off-screen. I've cried a lot for characters I love. One of Stephen King's characters actually had me weep and mourn. But as long as I feel like it fits into the context of the story, I'm okay with it. Death is a part of life and should be represented in fiction in equal measure, especially when the stakes are high. I read the book after the movie had already come out, so I always saw Kathy Bates in my mind as I read the story. But I can imagine for those who read it ahead of time, they must have been thinking it was going to be a pretty tall order to find someone who could represent that character appropriately. The movie was enjoyed by both the public and the critics, and Kathy Bates won an Oscar for her performance, so I think it's safe to say that most of the fans were pretty pleased by what they saw. And it's really no surprise that this is a great film. It was directed by Rob Reiner, who had previously adapted Stephen King's work in Stand By Me. The screenplay was adapted by William Goldman, known for writing the novel and screenplay version of The Princess Bride. Goldman did a fantastic job making the necessary changes and condensing the novel into the necessary movie-length running time. Most of the changes are logical and aid with pacing and the like. Probably the most noticeable is when Paul and Annie have dinner together outside the room. It creates a nice amount of movie tension seeing him attempt to drug her and fail. This also means that Paul doesn't get addicted to the novel in this version. Since we're not inside his head, it makes sense to largely skip the addiction angle. Despite the fact that we can't hear his thoughts, James Caan still brings so much of what is going on in Paul's head simply through his facial expressions. It's the kind of understated performance that could easily be overlooked, but shouldn't be. He does a lot more than just writhe in pain and try to escape in this film. That's for sure. Richard Farnsworth also plays the sheriff of the small town with a lot of charm, and Frances Sternhagen as his wife is so adorable and funny that I just love her.
Virginia, when you're in this car, you're not my wife, you're my deputy.
Well, this deputy'd rather be home under the covers with the sheriff.
And of course there is Kathy Bates. This Annie starts off seemingly so sweet and demure, and then slowly but surely becomes unhinged. Bates depicts Annie's mood swings so expertly, whether she's telling Paul how much she loves him, being depressed because of the rain, or enraged at him for doing her precious misery wrong. You just feel it. When I first saw this film, I didn't have nearly as much glowing praise for it. It's ridiculously silly to admit, but I was quite the snob in my teenage years, and the fact that they changed the axe moment to a sledgehammer moment was enough to turn me off. I remember what shocked me so much about the axe moment in the book was that it took more than one chop to get rid of the foot. Add to that the way he describes the axe hitting bone, and it's just so, horrible. So I was pretty disappointed not to see it in the movie. But with the wisdom of age and enough time to distance myself, I now understand it. Chopping off the foot itself probably wouldn't have been too much of a challenge for them. After all, they built an entire replica of Kathy Bates' head for the ending sequence. But the main problem would have been what they would have been able to do once the foot was gone. You have to remember, this is about 4 years away from Lieutenant Dan and Forrest Gump, and that was considered a pretty big achievement at the time. So trying to erase out his foot from all those scenes would have been a bit of a hassle. The same thing goes for the thumb in the book. The one change that feels a bit off is the idea that Annie wants the rest of the world to have Misery's return. When she was explaining to the sheriff that she was continuing the books after Paul had passed on, I figured it was just a bluff to get the sheriff out of her house. But then Paul convinces her to let him finish so that they can bring Misery back for the world, and I just don't buy it. In the book, Stephen King says that Annie sees the world as made up of herself, dirty birds, and poor, poor things, the latter of which she puts out of their misery. So I really can't see Annie giving a damn whether or not anybody else got to read Misery's Return. I guess they felt like waiting for her to see how the book ended just wasn't enough. But overall, I have to say that Misery succeeds both as a film and as an adaptation. If you haven't given either of these a try yet, I highly recommend that you do. Just because you already know about the big scene thanks to popular culture, doesn't mean that you can skip these. The details are really what make them shine. For my next review, I'll be going back to one of Stephen King's earliest stories to ever receive an adaptation, Graveyard Shift. What in the world are you doing?